Hi everybody, welcome to Unit 1, Subunit 1's Overview Conversation. These will be about 15-minute conversations that begin each of the subunits, so there'll be 6 of these. And the goal is to hopefully tie together the material that I'm going to present you in the subunit. So when you get to the separate folders for each of the 4 things in this unit, you'll find primary documents to read, secondary documents to read, and some video to watch. And I do have a suggestion for how you engage with them, so let's go to the next slide and see how that works, where I hope you take some substantive notes on what I talk about here for the major themes. I hope you take some substantial notes on the overview readings, which will come from our textbook. Then I hope you have a list or you've memorized the 5 key concepts, because as you take shorter notes on the other readings and videos that I've assigned for each subtopic, you can make sure you're paying attention to the key concepts in addition to the specifics from those themes. And that's because you're going to be tested on your ability to connect those things together. So that's what we'll be up to. I don't want to berate that today because we only have 15 minutes to get through a ton of stuff. So this unit, this subunit really, is about the emergence of the United States as an imperial power. Typically, we think of empires as a European phenomenon in the modern Arab nation states. So you have empires that the French have, that the Germans have, that the Belgians have, that the Portuguese have, that the Spanish have, that the English have, that the Russians have, and others dabble in. But we don't think of ourselves as an empire or having built an empire. But we took real advantage of the weakening Spanish state and went to war with them in 1898. So we're going to have this first part of the subunit about the U.S. And Spanish War, the Spanish-American War. So it's actually not popularly called that anymore because it doesn't recognize the remarkable role that, for example, the Cubans participated in a 30-year insurgency leading up to 1898. So they would rather not have it recognized as the Spanish-American War because they fought for a long, long time. There's also a very vibrant Filipino insurgency as well, not quite as long-lived as the one in Cuba. So some people have the very cumbersome name for the war is the Spanish-Cuban Filipino-American War, and some just call it now the War of 1898. Spanish-American War is still the most popular usage in the U.S. today, not necessarily among historians, but around. So this is the U.S. looking outward as they've developed now a very powerful industrial base, the strongest arguably in the world. They've developed a world-class Navy by 1890 or so. And one of the things that a Navy needs at this time is coaling stations around the world. If you have reliable coaling stations, and you don't have to rely on other states to grant you access to their coaling stations, you can do a lot more with that Navy than you might otherwise be able to do. These sort of come together and coalesce with real popular opinion that recognized that the Cubans in the Americas, they're our American brethren, deserve to be, should be freed from the yoke of Spanish oversight. The Spanish were rather cruel in Cuba, and so there was a lot of that popular sentiment. That said, other people wanted just to grab Cuba and make it part of the United States. And there's something called the Teller Amendment, I'll have you read, where we promised not to keep it for ourselves. But then there's a thing called the Platt Amendment, where we said we promised to keep it for ourselves, but we're going to do a lot of strange things in Cuba. But anyway, it makes us an imperial power with states, with possessions on 2 sides of the world. Cuba and Puerto Rico here, Philippines and Guam. We also, it wasn't part of the Spanish Empire, but we grabbed Hawaii from its indigenous leadership in 1898 as well. So there's the first thing. This one actually has a formal declaration of war. It's the only one in this subunit that does. So when you look at all the other times we're going to use militaries, they're not from a declaration of war. It's from the war powers or the leadership of the military that the president possesses. So the next one that starts really just a year later, 1899, is the United States' push to have an open door in China. Now, trade interests and evangelical interests, not I mean big E evangelical from the evangelical faith, or not just them, but literally evangelization. There's a real belief on the part of Christian denominations in the United States that China is ripe for evangelization. And so these 2 groups in particular, merchants and evangelizers, are interested in getting access to China. But China at that time had an awful time dealing with European and Japanese influence. And by influence, they would take over and force China in different parts to do what they wanted. And what the United States was afraid of is that the other powers were going to carve up China into pieces. You'll see a cartoon in the unit that shows a Confucian figure in chains, and the chains represent different powers that are threatening to take it. And they did very much have spheres of influence, but they hadn't formally carved up China and colonized it. The United States believes that China is as a power that should be supported on its own, and particularly that the door will be open. So this comes from a series of letters written to everyone else who had powers to say, let's leave the door open for trade to all of us. Not just that, but the closed door concept is what the United States is interested in the Americas. So we want the open door abroad and the closed door close at home. I will always remember one of my history profs talking about open door, closed door, open door, closed door. And it's the different approaches. We want free access to other parts of the world. We want limited access to our part of the world. And that'll come through a variety of things. The closed door, one of which is here through Teddy Roosevelt, who is part of the next topic. But before we get there, I want to preview some of what you're going to get in a later unit. So if you see here, you're going to watch a lecture that I gave at the Boer Symposium in 2022 about William Edgar Boer, Senator Boer from Idaho, and the outlawry of war movement. And one of the things we'll emphasize in there is how the characteristics of war and what was acceptable in war and how war was declared before the 1920s functioned, and then how it works afterwards. So you can see that this is the norm around the world. Sovereign powers are considered to be allowed to do these things. Gunboat diplomacy is one of those things where you can just actually take your larger ships, sail into someone else's harbor, and force them to do what you want. We famously did this with Admiral Perry into Japan in the 1850s. We basically said, we call it the opening of Japan. They would call it an invasion, where the gunboats showed up and said, we'll blow you up if you don't do what we want. So these were acceptable, and there were all kinds of reasons you could go to war. You could deploy troops. And so this War Manifesto database at Yale University lists these as the kinds of reasons. So one of the things you'll see here is debt collection and protection of trade, religious claims, humanitarian issues. You could use almost anything for a justification. When you get back to the open door, closed door concept in China, one of the things we were worried about is a fight some U.S. sailors and Russian sailors had with each other in a Chinese port, and it threatens war. Now, we're not interested in really going to war over China, even though we had at that time troops stationed in the Philippines. So these are things to be aware of. So when you hear that Teddy Roosevelt is doing interesting and odd things with American policy in the Caribbean, just know it's part of a long tradition that goes back more than 400 years of that time, which was acceptable to go in for these sorts of reasons. So here we are with Theodore Roosevelt as a really a figure who's presenting two very different faces of the United States. The imperialist part will see the United States going into the Caribbean and Central America, and a little bit into Northern South America, on pretexts of debt collection, to protect U.S. interests, and the like. And so it's tied to the Monroe Doctrine. You'll read the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine is a very famous American foreign policy instrument that says essentially that the Western Hemisphere ought to be free, and for us, and ought to be free from European influences. So you got to get them out and keep them out, and then have these brother republics or sister republics in the Americas. The Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, which you'll read about, is basically a statement that says to prevent other states from coming in for these sorts of reasons, debt collection among them, or protection of trade of theirs, or torts or civil wrongs. A tort is basically a business claim, like I tore up your business, therefore you have a tort against me. We had businesses and owners who would maybe have their bananas taken or a plantation burned down. So these were reasons why you could send troops in, so that we would if we thought a European power might take over a customs house or occupy a port, we would do it first, and we would collect the debt, and we would pay the Europeans. And this is part of the Roosevelt correlate to the Monroe Doctrine. We won't even get into some things else he did, which, for example, was making sure that when Panama declared independence from Colombia, that American forces just happened to be in the area to exercise some treaty rights we had about the Isthmus of Panama, where we had transportation to set up the building of the Panama Canal, and so we help Panama become independent under Teddy Roosevelt. But he also won the Nobel Peace Prize. It's the first head of state to win the Nobel Peace Prize. You'll read both his speech or his comments delivered on his behalf, and you'll see the statement from the Nobel folks on what he did. So we have sort of the emergence of a U.S. head of state as a notable diplomat to promote peace, and that was to end the Russo-Japanese War in 1905. So he's got these very different arcs to him that are worth our time. And the final thing as we lead up to World War I is the Mexican Revolution, which does overlap with World War I. The Mexican Revolution, the active phase, the fighting phase, lasts about 10 years, 1910 to 1920. And it is remarkably chaotic. There are factions and ideologies all over the country, and people who are on the left at one point later might be on the right, or they might be center, and they could come both directions and overlap. It was very difficult for U.S. diplomats to know who to recognize, when to recognize them, whether the promotion of peace over any desired end was what we wanted or not, particularly because a lot of the fighting took place on the border between the United States and Mexico. This is a postcard image of people on a hotel roof in El Paso watching the fighting between revolutionary forces and federal forces across the border in Ciudad Juarez. And so people would get shot because they'd be cheering. And so you always say it was a stray bullet. But I got to tell you, if I was fighting and my friend got shot and killed and I heard a giant cheer come up from the roof of a nearby hotel across the border, I might send a pot shot or two over there. But particularly an operator named Pancho Villa was active and came back and forth, had a lot of friends, got a lot of supplies, did a lot there, but got upset at the United States at one point and actually invades the United States. The invasion takes place at a place called Columbus, New Mexico, and then the United States sends in troops. So we have the complexity of what to do with the leadership, but we also send troops into Mexico on two occasions. One into Veracruz Harbor, which is way out over here, because of an incident like that would justify one of these things. I don't think we needed to go to war or occupy them, but that was the decision, in part because we didn't quite know who to treat with as a head of state. But then also we send General Pershing in on the Pershing punitive expedition to try and chase Pancho Villa down. And we almost go to war with Mexico before World War I starts, because they're not happy that we've sent troops into Mexico and are parading around. The Germans and the English are both interested in what happens. The Germans kind of hope we'll get bogged down in a war in Mexico. The English want us to join them, so they actually issue a fake thing called the Zimmerman Telegram that's proposing an alliance between Germany and Mexico. It doesn't exist for real, but they want us to think it is so that we get mad at Germany and go to war. So poor Mexico's got all kinds of troubles of its own. It's got us in there, and it's got Europeans messing around at the same time. It is absolutely worth understanding what's going on in the Mexican Revolution in terms of war, peace, and diplomacy. So that's what we've got. And I know it might lead to questions and issues that don't get covered because they're not traditional narratives in each of the subunits. You've got these overviews with the 5 key concepts. You've got this commentary that I've offered to you tonight in these 15 minutes, and the readings and the videos. And some of the videos will be very comprehensive what they describe, and some of them will be less so. So feel free to reach out, ask me questions. This stuff will come on the exam. You'll be able to use your notes when it's time to take the exam. There'll be essay exams where you get some major topics plus a theme or two, one of the key concepts or two, and you put them together. So it'll be useful for you to have some notes and to understand what's going on before you get there. So you got my email, you got my phone number, we got Zoom, we got Teams, we got all kinds of stuff. I look forward to visiting with you. Cheers.